Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Keith Hadley, and I teach English literature in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. I'm very happy indeed to have been invited to introduce this evening's lecturer, Father Timothy Radcliffe, who's a Dominican friar of the Order of Preachers. He's immensely distinguished and has held all the top roles in his order, notably as the global master of the Dominican order all through the 1990s. And no other member of the English province has ever achieved that office since the order's foundation at the start of the 13th century. At the same time, he was the ex officio Grand Chancellor at the Angelicum, that is the Pontifical University in Rome. He served on a host of bodies, councils and institutions, furthering the issues to which he's dedicated his calling, just one of which is the Las Casas Institute at Blackfriars, Oxford, named after the 16th century Spanish friar who sought to abolish oppression and enslavement of the native peoples of the Americas. And that institute now seeks to promote social justice and human rights. Father Radcliffe has written at least 11 books on Christian spirituality, and I've just learned that he's embarked upon yet another one. He's received so many honors and distinctions that there would hardly be enough room to chisel half of them on his gravestone. But Timothy Radcliffe is very far indeed from being just a very big cherry on the top of the clerical cake. And he's come to visit us in his present, simpler role as itinerant preacher. And don't let that term alarm you in any way, because his wanderings are not those of an ancient mariner come to corner us with any compulsive message, but rather he will have come to respond, to communicate, and to listen. In a phrase, to reach out, because he's best known and much loved for his powers of outreach. His career has taken him to every continent and given him an extraordinarily wide and deep knowledge of human experience that he's embraced in all its varieties, sometimes in very close contact with genocide and terrorism. In short, he's given his life, including his recent experience of serious illness. He's given his life, his heart, and soul to sharing the gift of religious faith. His mission has led him to address the most pressing issues of our time on peace, justice, and breaking down all those otherings that ruin our relationships, private and political. Indeed, his concerns have even stretched the tolerance of some of the divisions within his own church on LGBT issues, for one. Now, I personally have never met Father Timothy before earlier this evening, but I think I've known him somewhat for some time, from his books and articles and from his reputation. He's a bit of a legend as a very much loved consoler and inspirer of folk everywhere. If it's possible to summarize the gospel he preaches, it is one of compassion, bravery, and tenderness. His talk tonight is on faith and imagination. As someone himself who's much concerned with imagination as a term for vision and empathy in the humanities, I'm very keen to learn what it has meant, what it means to such a man as Father Timothy.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be back here in Lancaster. The first time for a long time. The last time I was here was when Adrian Cunningham was around, who many of you knew. And I'm very happy to be back in Lancashire. The roots of my family are here. They're Lancastrian. I'm afraid we made rather a mistake, and we moved over to Yorkshire some time ago. But I know that Lancastrians are forgiving people, so you'll overlook that. And I also ask for your sympathy and forgiveness. I flew back late last night from Switzerland and spent the day in the train getting here, a rather complicated day. So it's just possible I might go to sleep. You can go to sleep, there's no problem about that. But if I go to sleep, just tiptoe out very, very quietly. It's also the first time I've tried to give a public lecture since I had our operation for cancer of the jaw. So if I become unintelligible, don't worry, I haven't been drinking beforehand. Here we are on the site of an old Benedictine monastery. And it's fascinating to think that for centuries, people came here several times a day to sing poetry. It's extraordinary that the heart of the life of our country for centuries was people coming to places like this to sing poetry. It was the heart of British life. I wonder what else they read, those old monks. Did they read romances, stories of heroic tales, of love and war? What touched their imagination beyond those poems, those ancient Hebrew poems? Now, as Keith said, I'm a Dominican friar. I'm a preacher and a wanderer. And every day we too go back and we still sing those same poems. But for me, it's also important that I read novels, I go to films, I listen to music. I read poetry sometimes, I'm embarrassed to say, not as often as I should. So what I want to look at this evening is why is it that all this artistic, creative stuff, why is it important to who I am? And I try to answer this question without any great expertise. I did A-level English, and that was about the end of it. So I hope you'll forgive my rather amateurish musings. I hope it won't be like a lecture given by one of my Dominican brethren, provincial of Chicago. He gave the lecture, and at the end he sat down, and the applause was, shall we say, minimal. And he turned and he said to the man, "I hope it wasn't that bad, was it?" And the man replied, "Oh no, I don't blame you at all. I don't blame you. I just blame whoever asked you to come and speak in the first place." Blame John. I was on holiday in Cornwall at the time of the Queen's funeral. That great lying in state, that extraordinary queue. She was a woman of deep faith, a good Protestant Christian. But most of the people, I gather, who came to the lying in state were not. They were pretty representative of modern secular Britain. Most of them had other faiths or none. But it was fascinating to watch them coming up to the coffin. When her father had a lying in state, the great majority of the people who came were Christian, at least nominally. But they just walked past the coffin, looking neither to left nor to right. But this time, they bowed, they curtsied, rather like a genuflection. They saluted, they blew kisses, and many of them made the sign of the cross, a very Catholic ritual. So what was going on? I think many of them must have watched it all on live stream and saw what people were doing and found gestures. They found something to do. And what impelled hundreds of thousands of our contemporaries, many of them secular, to take part in this quasi-ritual, this quasi-religious event? We all know that there are two mainstays to British Christianity: the NHS and making queues. And here we had a queue for 5 miles in which people took part for hours and hours. And initial research suggests that they didn't come in grief. They came in gratitude. They wanted to say thank you. And to say thank you, they needed to find ritual gestures, a procession, a great big queue, signs of the cross, quasi-genuflections. What's going on in this secular Britain of ours? I'll come back to the gratitude a little bit later. The first point I want to make is that the secularism of our society is not, I think, mainly a rejection of belief in God. Very few people are attracted to atheism, which is a sort of religion anyway. I think our society is drawn to, perhaps I would say even trapped in, a sort of reductionist, fundamentalist culture. We are tempted by all sorts of reductionist ways of looking at the world. Ian McGilchrist wrote a wonderful, I think it's a wonderful book, called The Master and His Emissary. Most people love it. Some people hate it. And he argues that our present cultural situation is due to the dominance of one sphere of the brain, the left-hand sphere. Now, whether he's right about this, I don't know. I don't know anything about brains, as you will be able to see. But what he brilliantly portrays is the triumph of a way of thinking, a way of looking at the world, which is simplistic, which rejects metaphor and poetry. McGilchrist says, reductionism is the philosophy of our age. Within that culture, it has a corrosive effect on higher values a sort of easy cynicism, encouraging a mechanistic view of the human. And I think that what this leads to is not so much the rejection of belief as a sort of indifference, a facile indifference. All sorts of fundamentalism stifle, I believe, creative thought. And there are many forms of fundamentalism in our society. Economic fundamentalism, it's all the market. Nationalistic fundamentalism, you can see the rise of that everywhere in the world at the moment. My country, right or wrong. Scientific fundamentalism, which means that the only truths are those which can be measured. And most dangerous of all, religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism which says that I've got God wrapped up. I know what God thinks. If you don't believe me, you might get killed. But there are moments in our lives when we are drawn to challenge the limits of these fundamentalistic ways of looking at the world. Birth, falling in love, death, and even for some, the burial of a monarch. And then we reach for metaphors. We reach for poetry or music to try to propel ourselves beyond what we can easily say. And so the most important thing that I want to say this evening, so you can go to sleep after I've said this, the most important thing is that if you're a believer, a Christian like myself, and I hope some of you, we should regard the artists, the poets, the filmmakers, the songwriters, the creative bloggers even, we should regard them as our friends and our allies, regardless of whether they believe or not. Because what they do is they break through the crust of simplistic thinking. They keep open the question of transcendence. So as long as our society has at its center such artists, the question of God will remain, whether you accept it or not. Now, while I was preparing for this lecture, in my amateurish sort of way, I just happened to reread a novel by one of my favorite novelists, who's Ian McEwan. And I reread The Children Act. It's a wonderful book. In fact, it's so wonderful, I'm very tempted to spend the whole of the rest of the lecture talking about it, but I'm going to resist. In brief, a judge, Fiona, has to rule in a case where a child of Jehovah's Witness parents, is refusing a blood transfusion on religious grounds. And should he be allowed to or not? And the way that I read this novel, and I'm very willing for you to correct me, is that both the judge and the child are trapped in reductive forms of language, of mentality. The child is caught in a sort of religious fundamentalism, and the judge in the narrow constraints of legal thinking. But when they meet, this is the wonderful thing, when they meet, they are propelled, well, perhaps that's too strong a word, They peep beyond these fundamentalisms in music and in poetry. And this is the heart of the novel, I think. Fiona, this great judge, knows the temptation of poetry and music. Earlier in the book, she'd been captivated by a melody from Bach, and she whistles as she goes home. And she says, the notes strained at some clear human meaning, but they meant nothing at all, just loveliness purified, or love in its vaguest, largest form, for all people, indiscriminately, for children, perhaps. For children. And I guess she turns out to be a child herself. But all through this extraordinary novel, the judge and the child are pecking at the edge of what can be said in poetry and in music. Finally, the boy falls back into a sort of religious fundamentalism, and the irony is that he shares this with her in the most lovely poem. And she, what happens to her? She finds love again for her husband, and she's bowled over in a concert. And time and again in his novels, Ian McEwan raises the question of some ultimate meaning, often through music. And he suggests in the end that this is illusory, but he remains fascinated by it. Let me read you a long and wonderful passage from Saturday. This man goes into a jazz club to listen to his son. No longer tired, Henry comes away from the wall where he's been leaning and walks into the middle of the dark auditorium toward the great engine of sound. He lets it engulf him. There are these rare moments when musicians together touch something sweeter than they've ever found before in rehearsals or performance, beyond the merely collaborative or the technically proficient, when their expression becomes as easy and graceful as friendship and love. This is when they give us a glimpse of what we might be, our best selves, an impossible world in which you give everything you have to others but lose nothing of yourself. Out in the real world, there exist detailed plans, visionary projects for peaceable realms, all conflicts resolved, happiness for everyone forever, mirages for which people are prepared to die and kill. Christ's kingdom on earth, the workers' paradise, the ideal Islamic state. But only in music and only on rare occasions does the curtain actually lift on this dream of community, and it's tantalizingly conjured before fading away with the last notes. Marvelous. It's so marvelous, I'm tempted to read it all over again, but don't worry, I won't. So what McEwan does so beautifully is he conjures up this deep longing, and then he says, no. But he is my master, and he leads me on the way, but then I say, yes. Yes, that deep longing is true. Lines from Paul Murray, an Irish Dominican poet. What matters most is not the felt presence of God, nor is it some ecstatic grace of rapture. It is instead the lost untamed desire, the beggar's ache, the wound of longing in the heart. And so for me, I suppose if you want my religious faith, is that these longings are not illusory. They're not of an impossible world. And I find them beautifully articulated sometimes by people who don't believe, but who are my allies. So we started with the Great Queue, this quasi-ritual procession of hundreds of thousands of people making the sign of the cross and blowing their kisses and bows and curtsies, expressing gratitude. I think most religious faith is stretched between gratitude and longing. That's why they were there. Gratitude, which knits together all human communities which are worth living in. Gratitude, which in our society stands in tension with our consumerist culture, where everything is for sale. They say there's no free lunch. Let me just get a glass of water. In 1944, Karl Polanyi wrote an extraordinary book called The Great Transformation, The Political and Economic Origins of Our Times. And it plotted an extraordinary moment of cultural transformation, the birth of what he called the commodity fiction, the fiction that everything is for sale. Water, land, the woods, fertility, even human beings. Property, ownership, is the foundation from that moment onwards of human dignity. Slavery explodes and becomes the centre of British economy. And human beings are put on sale in an unimaginable scale. The commodity fiction. Now, almost 80 years after the publication of Polanyi's book, this commodity fiction has exploded in a way that he would never have dreamt possible. Today, you can buy almost anything. It used to be possible to buy the photographs of good-looking people to put on your Facebook page. They stopped that, alas, much to my regret. In Japan, if you want to apologize, you can hire the Tianjin Apology Company to do it for you. Their motto is, "We say sorry for you." Our prisons are becoming money-making industries. In California, for the price of $82, you can buy a cell upgrade. You can pay a woman, usually in India, to be the surrogate mother of your child. For $100,000, you buy the right to kill a rhinoceros. And of course, all over the world, people are driven to sell their bodies, to sell their body parts, to sell their kidneys. And we see the explosion of sex trafficking. Slavery hasn't finished. It just takes a rather different form. And this commodification of our world goes with what Eucharist calls the dominance of the left hemisphere of the brain, the hemisphere of abstraction, a loss of delight in individual things, in their particularity. what Gerard Manley Hopkins calls their inscape, their thisness. Shigeta Oshido is a Japanese Dominican who died recently, a friend of mine. He described himself as a Buddhist who met Christ and founded an ashram on Mount Fuji on the edge for Buddhists and Christians and people of other religions to live together. And Oshida hated what he called the third leg of the chicken. The third leg of the chicken is neither a left leg nor a right leg. It's an abstract leg. And Oshida said, when the third leg of the chicken begins to walk by itself, it is disastrous. And our perception of reality becomes abstract, remote from the vitality of lived experience, and everything becomes the color of the dollar. Everything becomes an item on the screen or the website to be bought with a click. And I think one of the roles of the great artists in our society is to restore a sense of the givenness of things, the gratuity of things, which are there to be delighted in. McGilchrist again. Everything of ultimate importance forms part of what George Steiner referred to as the sovereignly useless. Beauty is gloriously superfluous and unnecessary. It's pure gift. Sea Violet by Hilda Doolittle. The white violet is scented on its stalk. The sea violet, fragile as agate, lies fronting all the winds among the torn shells on the sandbank. Or supremely Gerard Manley Hopkins. I'm very nervous about quoting him since my kind Keith who introduced me is an expert on him. What would the world be once bereft of wet and wilderness? Let them be, oh, let them be left, wilderness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. So what I think the great poets, the artists, the painters do is to revive our sense of delight in the pure gift of things. Think of Terence Malick, that wonderful film, The Tree of Life. The labor of composing a poem. I'm afraid I've only composed one or two poems in my life, but I think the labor of composing a poem is that of accepting its gift, that it is given to you. And like birth, it's hard work sometimes to receive the gift. As T.S. Eliot famously wrote, for us, there's only the trying. The rest is not our business. Now, another novel that I just happened to be reading while I was preparing this lecture was This Is Happiness by Niall Williams. It's set in an Ireland which is losing its rooting in the Catholic world. But there is a certain nostalgia. There is a certain savour for what they've known. For gift, for grace. And as in McEwan, it's often in music that this surfaces. In a pub, musicians sit down, I quote, resuming their habitual shyness, but allowing a glint in their eyes now, if they met another, a silent acknowledgement, not so much, it seemed to me, that they had played the music, but that they'd been there when it happened. Isn't that wonderful? They'd been there when it happened. Later he writes of 3 musicians. They had a natural expertise that made it seem the music wasn't a thing learnt. They had no ownership of it either. The tunes were in the air or thereabouts. They were theirs only in the same way the fields and the rushes and the rain were. Yes, Hopkins would have cried out, long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. And for religious people, the gift points to the giver, who's present as the singer is in the song. As somebody forget, I totally forget who it was. The Creator is revealed precisely in the thing being itself. It points beyond itself, just by being itself. So great art summons us to gratitude and to longing. It pierces holes in the suffocating reductionism and literalism of our society. It takes us to the edge of words and discloses something that beckons us. And we all say, thank you, yes. We glimpse the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. There's one final step I want to look at. Time's creeping on and you've been very patient, and a remarkable number of you have not gone to sleep. For Christians, this encounter with meaning is personal. The meaning of our lives somehow addresses us and invites a response. Can our artists of the imagination help us there too? Can they help us to articulate what's happening, even if they don't believe? I only had time to glance at McGilchrist's latest book, which is extremely long, even longer than my lecture. He hesitates to call himself a Christian, but he has some sense of this encounter. The beauty of the cosmos, he says, allows us to acknowledge there is something way before, behind, above, and beyond ourselves. And that something is not inert or remote, but speaks to us and calls us to respond. And that we feel the need to do so with seriousness, reverence, and gratitude. I've tried not to quote my latest book, Alive in God, A Christian Imagination, because I'm hoping you're all going to buy it. You might be put off if I... Lots and lots of copies. But I just like to quote something I say there. Artists often do understand that living is a sort of response to an invitation. David Growler of Emory University says, all great art expects response, even consent. Mikhail Bakhtin insists, art includes obligation. He said, I have to answer with my own life for what I've experienced and understood in art, so that everything I've experienced and understood would not remain ineffectual. The life of René Maria Rilke, the great poet, was changed when he came across a headless statue of Apollo. And he looked at it, and he felt that it looked at him. And as Ian McGregor, that wonderful man, said, rather than him looking at it, every part looked at him, giving him the clear, invigorating, disconcerting instruction, du musst dein Leben ändern. You must change your life. Henry Nouwen experienced this when he came across a poster of Rembrandt's picture of the prodigal son. He suddenly realized, he just saw a poster of this painting which is in St. Petersburg. He suddenly realized that it addressed him. And it was a turning point in his life. So, when we stand before a painting, or we read a poem, or sort of music, the question is not, what does it mean? That implies the objective, distant response, so typical, I think, of post-17th century culture. We have to let it speak to us and teach us its own language. The father of one of my brethren was an abstract painter called Michael Finn. And every year I used to go and stay with him and his family. And most of his paintings consisted of 3 lines on the canvas. And I used to dread the moment when he'd say to me, "Timothy, come to my studio and look at my latest paintings." "Oh yes, there's another one with 3 lines. How interesting." What could I say? But then I lived with these paintings. I saw them out of the side of my eye. I let them interrogate me. I let them teach me their language, instead of asking that they become present in mine. So I think a question, we've almost got to the end, a question I would leave for you is, how are you addressed? What addresses you and puts you on the spot and asks that you answer? A last thought. All this comes together for a Christian in the Eucharist, where the giver becomes the gift. This is my body. I give it to you. I first began to understand this in 1993 when I was on a visit in Rwanda, right at the beginning of the genocide, before it had fully taken off. I'd arrived in the country and we planned to go to the north to visit my Dominican sisters. The Belgian ambassador came round and he said, "For goodness sake, don't go. The whole country's on fire." But we were young and foolish. Well, now I'm old and foolish. And we went, and everywhere we came across this devastating violence. The worst of all was going to this hospital ward filled with kids who'd lost limbs through warfare, landmines, eyes and legs and arms. I remember this little kid lying in bed who'd lost both his legs and an arm and an eye, and his father sat beside the bed weeping. And I went out into the bush weeping too, accompanied by 2 little kids hopping. They couldn't afford crutches. Wandering by, this big white man wept. And then we went to the convent of the sisters, which is filled with bullet holes from fighting. And I knew I had something, I was expected to say something. But what could I say? I didn't seem to have any words. But then I remembered there was something I could do. I could remember that last night when there seemed to be nothing to do, when the disciples were running away and Judas had betrayed him, Peter was about to deny him, most of the rest would scarper. And in this moment, when all that lay ahead was collapse, torture, death, when there was nothing else, it seemed, he committed this extraordinary gesture. I give myself to you. And for me, that is a gesture that has always, when I've struggled with my faith and wondered what it's all about, I've always got back to that. Iris Murdoch, that great philosopher, novelist, herself always struggling with belief, wondering whether it had some ultimate sense. She ends her book, The Bell, with a young man going through the struggles. And what she said, was the Mass remained, not consoling, not uplifting, but in some way factual. It contained for him no assurance that all will be made well that was not well. It simply existed as a kind of pure reality, separate from the weaving of his own thoughts. And I think this hope, this in the face of bleakness, I have so often encountered with song and music in the Middle East. When Yarmouk, to the south of Damascus, was bombed, Ahmad took out his piano, sat down in the middle of the ruins, and he played. A reporter describes the scene. Amid all this random destruction, a young man in a green polo shirt sits at a piano in the middle of the street, seemingly oblivious to the mortar and the sniper fire, painfully emaciated. Months of living off boiled weeds and cinnamon tea does that to a body. He plays and he sings almost to himself with total absorption. It looks like pure defiance. It looks like hope. It looks as though something in this world is there that is more powerful than bullets and poison gas. So I'm here this evening to give thanks to all those artists, those creative people who challenge the stultifying reductionism of so much contemporary culture. They nurture my sense of gratitude. They nurture my longing, even if they don't believe. So I thank them, and I thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, Father, Timothy, you have impressed on us the importance of gratitude. So I think we all want to say a very special thank you to you. Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful talk. You must be exhausted, having traveled all this way from Geneva through the trains, through the different obstacles I know you've had to face to get here to do this. So you must be exhausted. But I know one thing about you now more than ever, and that is that your imagination is inexhaustible. You'll be showing us how you open your mind and heart to everything that is other outside. Open and open and open and open. And when I was looking at the title of your talk today, I was trying to open my own mind to it, faith and imagination. And I thought, I can see why faith needs imagination, heaven help us, but does imagination need faith? I think you've suggested us tonight whatever faith means, and that's a very big thing in itself. But I think imagination does need faith too, myself, and I think I would agree with you about that. Thank you once again. I just want to say to everybody that there won't be any questions. It's so difficult to conduct that sort of session, and Father Timothy must be exhausted. But there is wine at the back of church, and you're all welcome to stay and have a drink and talk and chatter and perhaps, ask any pressing questions you've got. Thank you all so much. Thank you, John, for arranging this wonderful event. Once more, I say thank you very much.